I'm excited. Thank you. I'm very excited to say that in this August, it will be 9 years that we've started this program. And honestly, other than a couple we missed when COVID first hit, even though we said no way could we do it virtually, we did it virtually. And I am one of the least technological people you'll ever meet, but it has worked, and we've had a really loyal audience, and we've expanded our audience because we've not only had participants from all over, but we've also had presenters from all over. And our presenters are really just the cream of the crop. Like we have, like tonight, Reverend Kline, who's coming to us from Harrisburg. We've had Walter Grayson come to us from, where is he now? Minneapolis, I think, Patty.
Yeah.
We have people coming to help us with programs, and they tell us they feel privileged. So it really has been an incredible honor to host this program. We really wanted to bring the program back as far as a hybrid program in August, but the library is going through extensive renovation right now. Our entire downstairs is torn up. So unfortunately, we can't bring back the program right now. But our August program is going to be absolutely amazing. We have Laura Giacombe coming from Monmouth University, who is not only a librarian, but also a racial healer. And she's going to be joining forces with somebody in Las Vegas as far as helping break our group down into groups. And we are going to do a whole program on racial healing. So it'll be a great celebration. And then after that, we're going to do, probably within the month, a community read of a book that we ask everybody, hopefully, to read, and then we'll discuss it. So a lot of exciting things. July 26th will be our next program. August 30th will be our program with Laura, and anyone that is interested in that program will ask that you register and send you a very quick questionnaire before our program. I do want to say a couple of our programs, we've had to make some changes. Our story time, we've been having weather permitting in the park, and Claire will attest to this. We have had 100 people now, up to 100. Children, parents, they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So now that we have them outside, who knows how many people are going to join us. But Miss Sierra is a wonder, and we're really pleased that despite everything that's going on, we're able to still have summer reading with some changes. And our story times and summer reading has started. So that's another thing. A lot of things are happening at the library. Our bridge program has gotten so big that we have to move it to the senior center, who's just been renovated, because we can't accommodate people in the space that we have. So these are good problems to have. Tonight's program is very dear to my heart. I have talked a little bit about my background in the past, but I've watched anti-Semitism really grow all over the world in the US, and I see it growing a lot in Monmouth County. And Rabbi Kline and I have kept up a dialogue over the internet and talking about some of the problems. I mean, I know that she is off the wall and some of the things that come out of her mouth, but somebody sent me today, Roseanne Barr was saying that there was no Holocaust, and this was all made up. And you know, as off the wall as she is not the only person saying this. And this is a scary thing, and Rabbi Kline is wonderful about bringing a community together. We were very sad when he left our Tinton Falls community, because he really is somebody that is not divisive at all and brings together people of all faiths. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend Patty White, who's going to tell you a little bit about Zoom etiquette, because every time I think we're on the same page, something happens. So Patty, if you could briefly review everybody
Well,
how they're to behave this evening.
well, it looks like almost everybody
Yeah,
has already muted themselves. So
right.
just, of course, a reminder, if you're not speaking or offering a comment, please remember to mute your device. You're certainly welcome to keep your video on. We are recording this program. Rabbi Kline, while he's doing the PowerPoint, if you want to offer something relevant and you want to put it in the chat, Claire Phelps will be monitoring that, and we may be able to call on you during the presentation or else afterwards. And we're going to be sharing a PowerPoint. I'm going to see, I've never done this, but I'm going to see if I do the speaker view when Rabbi Kline is speaking, that might, work for people. But either way, welcome everyone. And Claire, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Patty. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program this evening. So happy to have you here. We are so thrilled to have Rabbi Marc Kline with us this evening, formerly of Monmouth Reformed Temple in Tinton Falls for 8 years. He is now serving as interim rabbi in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at Temple Ohev Shalom. He, as Linda has said, he's made a career of working with people through obstacles that drive people apart. He's worked to rebuild congregations, and his work in justice and peace building promotes equality in race, gender, sexual orientation, and religious cooperation. He also consults with nonprofits on diversity and leadership. So he loves meeting people for coffee and getting to know people. So I will now turn the evening over to Rabbi Kline, and thank you again for being with us.
Claire, thank you so much. And like I said, before many of you got on, it's great to see names and faces of people where I am and where I've been, people I love dearly. And it, this is a tough one because I don't really want to speak about anti-Semitism. I'm going to have to at the end, but I really want to help us understand some of the dynamics of why things are happening, which will help us, I hope, come to some better understanding of how to cope, how to deal, and how not to devolve into some of the nightmarish behaviors that we end up throwing at each other. That said, we're talking about the rise in religious fundamentalism. I really want to start with the macro picture of fundamentalism in America before I deal with the Jewish piece, and then specifically the central New Jersey piece, and then the whole how we fix. Okay. I'll invite questions or thoughts along the way. Claire and Patty and Linda will let me know if there's an interjection that I should address. So with that, I guess, Patty, I need the first official slide after the title slide. That's the title slide. And by the way, I'm going to make an ultimate confession to everybody that at the ripe old age of almost 63, this was my first ever PowerPoint. So my children are proud of me. So thanks, Joe. The rise in American religious fundamentalism. Elie Wiesel, I think, put it best that ultimately the only power to which we should aspire is the exercise of power over ourselves. But what we're finding in this world is that we need to exercise power over each other, and we need to win. And we're going to address why some of that happens as we move forward. But just from a historical perspective, up until the mid to late 70s, there were always religious voices that were tangent to religion. We go back to the Baptist Church that wrote Thomas Jefferson, admonishing him not to allow for a national religion, which at that point would have been the Anglican Church. because this was supposed, well, the whole foundation and enterprise of creating in America was to escape religious persecution and fundamentalism. But it raised its voice on specific issues. Certainly, communism was always an issue. When John F. Kennedy was running for president, there was the hue and cry that the Catholic Church would control America, but it wasn't as pervasive on an every issue imperative as it's become. The real link between religious involvement in politics, most of us trace to Jimmy Carter, because he ran for president as an evangelical. And it was his faith that was foundational in how he saw his commitment to serve. And certainly after his presidency, it was his faith that led him to continue to do work all over the world, bringing people together, and ultimately leaving the Southern Baptist Convention because of its approach to women. Oddly, it was the response to an evangelical voice that led to the rise in religious fundamentalism's attraction to political power. Lord Acton said, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." But people sought power to make decisions, and I guess that's the next slide. Carter was too liberal, so the moral majority, and I put that in quotes because they never were the majority, and I'm not sure always how moral it was, but Jerry Falwell and many of the televangelist leaders in the Christian world sought power, and they sought what they called the Southern strategy, the first time since the Civil War that you could have a political white conservative base taking control of government. And what results from that is what we now call the culture wars. And the further result has been the absolute separation in America of people, not based on political ideologies, but their religions that have forced political ideologies. So even while we're all going to houses of worship, we talk about a God who loves everybody and who makes no mistakes, and you know, all of the love language, people are using God, religion, and Bible to win wars over each other. Sardonic as it is, believing that their version of the Bible is the only authoritative one, and I say their version because there are substantial differences between even just the English translations of the Bible, never mind in their original languages, and never mind the fact that the Bible, whether it's the Jewish Bible or the larger Christian Bible, are only, you know, one take on sacred texts in this world, as if we have the power to say what God says and wants through only our voice. And so I like to tell people that God has never tapped me on the shoulder and told me, you know, I'm 5'6", I hate corned beef, and you know, I have no idea what God is. But what I absolutely believe is that no body has the unique take on the source that creates and sustains everything. But it is this fundamentalism and this conservative bloc that gave rise to Ronald Reagan in 1980, and to what we've now clearly seen as a religious political divide between, it's easy to say the Democratic and Republican parties, but I'm not sure it's really that clear cut, but certainly an ideology. So to the next slide, please. So we always think about fundamentalism as the right, though. Is there a fundamentalism on the left? And fundamentalism is just a tendency, certain groups and individuals that believe their way is the only way. I have just synopsized the definition I put on the screen. But the moment that you believe that there's only one way and that God speaks only one voice, you know, we do have this problem in the Jewish world where even the issue of kashrut, if you go into a grocery store, there's 20 different symbols that you'll find in a normative grocery store for kosher. And the question is, if it's kosher, why do you need to have 20 competing symbols of what's kosher or not? And then there's the differences not just between the religions of the world, the Judaism, the Christianity, the Islam, the Hindu, the Baha'i, etc. But then within the religious traditions, you've got these fundamental breaks, so that when I was part of the Interfaith Hunger Task Force in Little Rock, Arkansas, when I was still practicing law, my first meeting, I was told, okay, we've got a Muslim, we've got a Jew, we've got a Catholic, and now we need a Christian. It was the first time in my life I'd ever heard that Catholics weren't Christian. Okay. So there's a saying in the rabbinic tradition, do your ears hear what your mouth is saying? And we say some of the strangest things, and ultimately, oftentimes, we all sound like Yogi Berra. If anybody knows the reference to the many famous Yogi Berra-isms in this world. So there is a fundamentalist left that believes that everything the right is doing is wrong. And so we get into this power play of you can't be correct because I'm correct. And the damage that's done by a fundamentalist left is as devastating to society as the damage is done on the fundamentalist right. And it's really odd that in a 360 picture, you have the fundamentalist right and the fundamentalist left actually being right next to each other, even though they seem at the opposite ends of the spectrum. The rhetoric that comes out of "there's only my way" is the same rhetoric. So we move to the next one. Next slide.
Okay, I'm trying. Why is it not cooperating? Oopsie, come on.
Well, the next slide says, so how does this trend of religious fundamentalism in politics impacts Jews and Judaism? Effectively, there it goes. I love the graphic of Moses. I just, so we can stay here for just a second. Jews have always been, in modernity, been a minority in the communities in which we've lived. We've been on the fringe, literally and geographically, not just in terms of any type of power structure. Anti-Semitism is not new. It goes back to the beginning of, I would even argue, Constantine and the foundation of Christianity as the national religion of Rome, because before there was actually a separation of Judaism and Christianity, there was the people who lived in Jerusalem and that area, which became Jews and then Christians and later Muslims and etc. And Syria and everybody that came through the trade routes. Jerusalem was the center of the trade route and were victimized by every nation that came through seeking power. The separation of the northern and southern kingdoms in Israel and then the demise of both happened because the fringe group of people, the Jews, Israelites, the natives to Palestine, got in the way of the progress of people having their say and their way in imposing their God traditions on the world in which they lived. So this is not new, but when we get to modernity, you find anti-Semitism playing a huge role in how we've had to migrate and live and change how we live around the world. The rise of the Zionist enterprise because of the Dreyfus affair in France. It became clear to Theodor Herzl and that cohort that there was going to have to be some place where we didn't have to worry about living on the fringe of society and being blamed for the ills of everything that happened. Originally, they were looking at Argentina and the Congo. The Balfour Declaration decided that it should be in Palestine. And people say that was wonderful of Lord Balfour. At the same time, they have to know historically that England was trying to get rid of its Jews back then. So they were trying to say, well, we'll send you to the place, the biblical homeland, and it'll all be good. Certainly with the impact of World War II, at the end, when Europe will not take its Jews back, and no one else wants them, including the United States, they had to create a homeland. And if there's such a thing as coincidence, Einstein said coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. I've been working with some people, and I happened to see a transcript from meetings in 1948 dealing with the displaced Jews. And they were trying to force them to go to Israel to fight the war, the continued war of independence, even though they didn't want to. But the alternative was to return them to their homes in Europe, and Europe wouldn't let them. And so this isn't just forward, these are transcripts of meetings that happened in world leaders between 45 and 1948. The UN creates the state of Israel, taking the Jews it didn't want but couldn't kill, and displacing an indigenous Palestinian population, the people who sided with Hitler. So the people we don't want, we'll throw them against the people we don't like, and they'll kill each other off, and we'll be through with both of them. So Israel wasn't even created because it was an apology to the Jews for what happened. It was part of an attempt to rid the world of the remnant Jews at the hands of the Arabs, or the Arabs at the hands of the Jews. What we do know is the UN, having created Israel and the war happening immediately thereafter, the UN didn't lift a finger to defend the nation it just created, and has never done anything for it since. So as Jews would come to America, many came because they were, well, they had to be sponsored initially by family members who were here. And no differently than we experienced in Europe, we lived in ghettos, as, by the way, did the Italians that came, and all of the immigrants that came, not wanted by the people of multi-generations who were here. And we lived in our ghettos. And then the moment you are continued segregated from society, people have their say about what they think about you and what they'll allow you to do. I would argue that it's not a secret that the United States knew what was happening in Nazi Germany in 1938. In the headlines of the newspaper in Los Angeles, there's a headline that says, in 1938, come get your Jews before we get rid of them. There were, Madison Square Garden was filled with the American Nazi Party rallies with thousands of people. So I would argue there's never been a philo-Semitic period in Israel, in America, until really until 1967. And there was a major turn, because in 1967, the Jews who had always said, don't make waves, they let us be here, we'll stay in our small communities, at that point said, no, we need to have our role and our place in the world. The tradition teaches us that the Messianic age is about shalom ba'olam, peace for the whole world, not just for us, and certainly not just Jewish domination, but to be part of the fabric of society. And we marched with Dr. King, we marched with the Civil Rights Movement. Oddly, the number of Jews and members of Black America today that don't realize the Jews were involved in the Civil Rights Movement is alarming. But we were part and parcel, having been just a decade plus from the ovens and the gas chambers, understanding the plight of Black America, until the mid-70s, when somehow Jews became white. And all of a sudden our dollars allowed us in to places that we weren't allowed before. And so the signs were no longer no Jews, no blacks, no dogs, to no blacks, no dogs. And we thought we had it made at that point. And I grew up believing that I was part of the fabric of America and that anti-Semitism was a thing of the past. And then the rise in fundamentalism. So while we have become, the United States has got the second largest population of Jews in the world, and we've become very complacent in our world here, the world of anti-Semitism has continued to rally and grow around us, and in part because of our complacency. And I'll come back to that later on. So the next slide, please. So when we talk about Judaism, we have to acknowledge the population issues. In the Haredi, which is the ultra-Orthodox world, and there's not an ultra-Orthodox Judaism, there's ultra-Orthodoxies, but the Haredi population is growing by leaps and bounds, in part because they're having 7 to 10 children or more in each family. But we're also finding that the Haredi population is growing, Orthodoxy is growing, because as younger adults are on spiritual journeys trying to find their way, the first leap is usually to an extreme, from nothing to the extreme. And so people are flocking to either secularism or fundamentalism in Judaism and every other religion, because that's the way human nature. But if you look at this chart right now, Belgium, the 2020 Pew Report. The Pew Report is world research to check all sorts of pieces of the world Jewish population. But you can see that in the largest population proportion of Orthodox Jews is in Belgium in 2020. But the largest population of Haredi are Israel and the United States. So we go to the next slide. Jews under 30, this is what I was speaking to earlier. If you look at the split within the Jewish world, these are the rough percentages of how this plays out. You'll notice that there's more young people finding their way into Orthodox Judaism, and more people leaving, older people, younger people are leaving the liberal branches and finding their way into nothing or into the ultra-Orthodoxies. Okay, so where you live in Central Jersey is feeling the greatest impact, because the largest growth of the Orthodox population in America is in Central Jersey, which is part of the dynamic that you all are feeling. And before I go any further, it's important to understand that when your society is growing, where are you going to put people? So when we talk about the spread of a population, while I know it feels that they're spreading their tentacles, which has been one of the anti-Semitic tropes, the octopus spreading the tentacles all over, very organically, if your community is growing, where are they going to grow? Into the neighboring communities. So while it feels like they're trying to proselytize, and while it feels that they're trying to usurp, there is a piece of that is absolutely organic, because Lakewood is becoming the focal point in ultra-Orthodox Jewish education in the United States of America. Okay, so the next slide. We know that the Haredi population is growing. We know that as people age, they generally see a more reasonable path. There is what we call religious switching, some of it outside from Judaism to outside, but some within the branches of Judaism. And this chart shows some of that, how people start off as they're in their youth and how they grow. 60 to 70% of the current Haredi population will remain Haredi. That means 30 to 40% will either leave Judaism, formal Judaism, or find themselves at home somewhere else. But the trend of switching is not going to be significant enough to change the reality that in 2040, we're expecting 1 out of every 5 Jews in America to be ultra-Orthodox, which is a significant number, especially when you live in the area where all ultra-Orthodox Jews are congregating to live. So you can expect that this trend of the growth of the ultra-Orthodox world is only going to continue. Okay, so the next one, please. So there was a formal study done on Haredi Jews. Daniel Stetsky, the research fellow at the Jewish Policy Research Center, actually did a study on the world Haredi population, and here are a couple of the things that he found. Due to the next one. The average life expectancy for Haredi men is 83 years, and for Haredi women is 86 years, compares with 76 years for American European men and 82 years for women. And this is always thought to be an anomaly, because if you are in a hospital, the ultra-Orthodox men really don't take care of themselves. And during COVID, it was really a challenge when the rabbis are saying, you have to come to services and you can't wear a mask. And then they were contracting COVID and filling the ICU. And I had a debate with one of the rabbis when I still lived there. I was a hospital chaplain. And I said, you told them to come to services and not to wear masks because God would protect them. So why are you taking up public resources in the hospitals? You know, send them home, and if God wants them to be fine, they'll be fine. That argument didn't go very well, but that was the anomaly. One of the reasons for the life expectancy that is so much higher is also the purity of lifestyle. I mean, think about the things we consume, the chemicals in our foods, and things like that, and how those things don't exist in a strictly kosher world. So some of the indulgences that we allow ourselves that the ultra-Orthodox don't allow themselves account for a longer lifespan. They also aren't as transient. So one of the things that's caused our worlds to not expand in terms of years as much is that we don't live near the people that we love, and so we don't have the support systems in place. Well, in the Haredi communities, you will be in a community with your great-great-grandparents. And so you've got this incredible support system for anything that is needed that we don't have. And so there are reasons for the expanded life expectancy, but that also means that there's going to be more people in the Haredi community for more years because of that. Okay, next, please. 92% of all Haredi Jews live in either Israel or the United States. This was on the graphic. Given that 85% of the world Jewry lives in those two countries, concentration is higher. 700,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews live in the United States, even while they're only 12% of the Jewish population. And when you concentrate over 100,000 of them in central New Jersey, you have to understand the magnitude of that impact, which means 1/10 plus of all the ultra-Orthodox Jews in America live in your backyard. Now, to step aside from that as an alarming note for a moment, how do you provide for 100,000 people in a community? What does it take to provide, in the best case scenario, what is it that takes that's needed for 100,000 people? You've got to have a healthcare system that is focused on those people, because they have special needs that other healthcare services wouldn't be able to provide or wouldn't provide. You have to have geography for them to live. You have to have food sources. You have to have specific schools. So all of the systems that are changing because of the growth of this population, if we take it outside of the Jewish piece for a moment, and whatever that may mean, organically, an entire region has to change how it lives just to accommodate 100,000 people. And many have moved in the last 15 to 20 years. So this hasn't been a small or gradual growth. This has been an explosive growth because Lakewood became the center of Jewish, ultra-Orthodox Jewish education. The yeshiva that was built there has a worldwide reputation for being one of the preeminent places of Jewish scholarship, ultra-Orthodox versions of Jewish scholarship. And with that does come resources. And so the identity, the communities had to change to meet the needs of that community. So when we look at the fundamentalism, and certainly in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish world, there's a political fundamentalism that leans very much to the right, very conservative. We have to ask the question, which is on the next slide, is fundamentalism necessarily wrong? On the one hand, it's easy to say it absolutely is wrong, whether it's right or left. But the question is, would they call themselves fundamentalists? I had this conversation with Dr. Jamul Faruqi in Lexington, Kentucky. And he said, the fact that I am a strictly observant Muslim doesn't mean I'm a fundamentalist. And of course, this is true in the Christian world. Not every evangelical, is closed-minded. We lump people together. And then we use the term fundamentalism. And is it necessarily wrong? Well, if you meet the definition that I gave earlier, it is if you really believe that there's only one way. But how many people do we call fundamentalists because we don't agree with the strictness of their lifestyle, or we don't understand the strictness of their lifestyle? And because their lifestyle ends up impinging upon our lifestyle. And as I pointed out, in some very organic ways, if 100,000 people move to an area, you're going to need to do things to change society to accommodate them, no differently than you would want to be accommodated moving into a new society. So that's really the conundrum that Central New Jersey faces, is what is fundamentalism and by whose label, and where is the concept of human and the need to take care of the human in all of the vitriol that is being thrown. So yes, there are Jews that don't pay. Even when I was still there, there was the contractors who were arguing that some of the Jews abused the business world. And there is because I don't live there, I can say it's not an accusation, but proven that there are abuses of the Medicare system in Lakewood. And there are all of these legal abuses. And in Israel, I was part of uncovering the work of a yeshiva, an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva in Jerusalem that was selling body parts on the black market to raise funds for the yeshiva. These things happen. And they happen in every religion, and they happen outside of religion. But my experience with most Orthodox Jews is that they want to be Jewish, and they want to live in a community that will support them being able to live their lifestyle, which, by the way, is why the conservative evangelical movement became political, because they thought that Jimmy Carter was being too liberal, and the people in that world were being too liberal in terms of sexuality and the mores of society. And if we go back to 9/11, it was the Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson who said that we deserve to be attacked because of the liberal Supreme Court. This is fear-based. And so when we start a conversation being afraid of somebody for what we think they believe, or how their beliefs are different from ours, the only result is a devolution of society. And so a lot of disputes can be handled best just by having a conversation of what makes you tick. Why is this happening? When Ocean Township was battling the yeshiva that was being built and renovated and opened there, when I first called into question why they needed to take over that area, I was called anti-Semitic, and I'm a rabbi. And, because the treatment that they've received was so abominable that any question of their motivation became an attack. When I lived in Lexington, Kentucky, Mahmoud Shalash was the imam at one of the mosques. And when I got there, I received warnings about, don't get involved with Mahmoud Shalash. He hates Jews, he hates Israel, and he's a criminal. And it happened that his daughter and my daughter became friends in high school. And they forced us to get together. And so I called Mahmoud and I said, we need to get together. And he said, can I come to the synagogue? And when I told people he was coming, they wanted to have guards there to make sure that he didn't come strapped with bombs. And his story to me was the day he got to Lexington, he was told that all the Jews already hated him. And so that's how he responded. And he and I became friends, and I spoke at the mosque and he spoke at the synagogue. And, but the rhetoric that predated either he or I governed how we were supposed to hate each other from the very beginning. And I find that some of the conversations in central New Jersey are the fear of, I don't know you and you're coming into my community, and there's an attack, and the response is then equally vitriolic. And so it happens that one community is seen as being ugly when certainly not all of them are, and some of that is simply a response to the failure to give any concern for a welcome into the community. So their only response then is, I have to take over the entire community. And I'm not downplaying what's happening there. It is horrific, and chaos fills the void, and the void of decency is being filled with the ugly, the real ugly. And so you have power brokers whose only goal is to wield power, who are controlling the economy of the ultra-Orthodox world and the economy of the world that's trying to keep them out. And there's no place for us to have that human conversation. If I can have the next slide, please. So I took iconic Red Bank and the Stone Pony. So what does it mean to Central Jersey? As you are seeing more and more people who are dressed in the uniforms of ultra-Orthodoxy walking your streets, buying homes and building businesses, and needing accommodations so they can continue to live their life, the conversation has only gotten ugly. Even before we got on tonight, we were sharing some stories about some of the problems that have existed and the rhetoric that is happening in online conversations, pro and con Orthodox Jews. Does anybody have a problem with we're talking about pro and con people? And that's what it's devolved to. So if you're a diabetic, or actually let's make it clear, because this one hits really close to home for some of us. You have a gluten intolerance and you walk into a restaurant and you ask for their gluten-free menu and they don't have one. How welcome do you feel in that restaurant? Or, as we've experienced, because my wife has a gluten allergy, when someone says, oh, don't worry, we won't put rice on your plate. And our immediate response is to walk out of that restaurant because they have no understanding. Well, for us, it's, how can you be so ignorant in a world that is so global? And their response is, how can you walk out of my place like that? So, and we all have these experiences, not tied to our religion, but tied to the necessities of how we see life. And there are places that we won't go to because they can't accommodate our needs. How many of us remember the days when there were smoking sections in restaurants, and you didn't want to sit anywhere near that because you didn't want to be anywhere near the cigarette smoke? And there were some restaurants that didn't cordon off enough space so you wouldn't go into the restaurant because they were trying to accommodate part of a population that did want to smoke at dinner, as if those people's rights didn't matter. So we live by these rules all over the place in our daily lives. And yet, when it comes to something charged, religion, we have absolute intolerance for each other. We will not work to accommodate each other, and we will not accept when someone can't accommodate us. Lori and I have grown to the place where if someone doesn't understand gluten, we thank them for their time and say, looks like a great menu, but we can't eat here. Which is very different than, what do you mean you don't understand that rice isn't gluten? We've evolved a lot in how we handle that situation. But can you imagine that being the case right now, someone saying, well, I can't certify your food as kosher. But yet, we want you to spend money here. You come here, the guy wants to spend his money there, but you're not able to accommodate him or seem not willing. There's an affront, and it's no different than when the Catholic Church says we're not going to ordain a woman as a priest, and there are women who desperately want to serve in the Catholic Church and have to go outside of the Catholic Church to serve as priests in a Catholic church. Or the current schism in the Methodist Church over gay marriage and gay clergy. Thank you, Reverend Gil Caldwell, for starting that one. So how it affects Central Jersey, it's a hotspot for tourism, not just Lakewood for Orthodox Jews, but Central Jersey lives on its tourism, asking people from all over the world to come and be there. And then people do, and if they don't make their own accommodations, they don't feel welcome. And when they do make their own accommodations, we look our noses up at them and say, oh, that's a problem. So that's what's happening there right now. If I can go to the next slide, please. So the other thing they do is then segregate themselves and build their own world. There's a new airport in Lakewood. I don't know if it's finished yet. It started being constructed last year. And this is a rendering of what it's supposed to look like. Quite a beautiful building. Why do you need an airport in Lakewood? Well, because people know that they can come to Lakewood in plane or chopper and be in a community that will be supportive of the lifestyle that they need. And they don't have to worry about any of the other issues of dealing with a society that's intolerant to them. Well, what that's going to do, more and more money and business is going to come straight to Lakewood and not through Newark and not through JFK and anywhere else. And so the economy in Lakewood is booming right now, which is in part why it's moving into Franklin and into the other areas. And it's very insularly growing and booming because they don't feel comfortable moving into a community that doesn't want to welcome them, and the community that doesn't want to welcome them doesn't feel comfortable saying, maybe we need to expand how we see the world. And by the way, it happens to Muslims as well, but there's more Jews than there are Muslims in this area, and it's more concentrated there. But it happens to the Hindu world as well. White normative America doesn't tolerate something different. The number of times I heard, even in New Jersey, you're white, I thought you were Jewish. As if somehow that's my race. And by the way, President Trump decided to make my race Jewish and my national origin Jewish, because rather than change the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 68 to include religion as a protected class, which Congress could have done, the president's edict decided that I was no longer a white person and I was no longer an American. You know how many Jews thought that was great that we now had protection in public education because of that presidential edict? But that only fuels the fire, because the moment I then say protect me because I'm Jewish, I'm then told, well, but then I guess you're not an American either. So it's the things that we don't even understand about what's happening to us. But in the meantime, the economic growth of Lakewood, and I apologize, my ADD is coming through in that diversion. But if you can look at the notes, the growth of this area between 2010 and 2020, and what we know between 2020 and today, the explosion of population that's happening in that area. Just in the 1 year that we actually, or 2 years we lived in Long Branch when we moved from Red Bank out to the ocean, the dramatic change in population in Long Branch was palpable. And so this is the new world. So we move on to the next slides. First response is anti-Semitism. No Jews allowed. We've all seen, and of course, from Charlottesville, and the anti-Jewish chants there. But our first response is to the vitriol and to hate, and it's because we're afraid of what we have to give up. When we're talking about women's rights and LGBTQ2+ rights now, the number of placards we say that remind us that equal rights doesn't mean losing rights. It does mean losing power. And power is rooted in fear. If I don't get my way, then I somehow am not as valid as a human being or in my own faith. And the reason that people have to fight each other over religion, I believe, is that nobody understands their faith to begin with. Is that they understand some of what they've been taught at the church or the synagogue or the mosque or the ashram, etc. But I have to prove that my religion is somehow better than yours, so that I can feel valid in my religion. And I took a lot of heat right before I moved from Jersey. I was asked to help ordain Kerwin Webb at Second Baptist Church in Asbury Park. And I was blessed to be involved in ordaining a Baptist minister. And I never felt compromised as a Jew to help someone be faithful in his tradition. But we're afraid to do that. The last interfaith clergy trip I led to Israel for the Jewish Federation of the Heart of New Jersey, I had an Orthodox rabbi who would not walk into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And he said it's because there's a tselem, an image of Jesus on the wall. Lots of images of Jesus on those walls. But I said, do you walk into art museums? And he said, yes. And I said, well, there's lots of Jesuses in art museums. So what you're telling me is you're anti-Christian. That had never clicked in his head. And when we got to the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth, he was the first one off the bus, which was great. But we're indoctrinated in things, and we don't think past the indoctrination way too often. And the violence that has been caused in the defense of religious bigotry in history is just horrific. And I can't believe that God ever would support whatever God is, that God would ever support us killing each other over who owns God. But that's what we do. And that's what's playing out in central New Jersey right now. So the next one, please. Next slide. I'm running through these trying to leave lots of time. But so why is there fundamentalism? It's the fear of engagement. It's the crisis of faith. I will say that if someone accepts something beyond his, her, or their narrow framework, it can be a crisis for them. So for an ultra-Orthodox Jew to eat in a restaurant where there is pork served or a non-certified meal, given the indoctrination through which that person lives, that becomes a crisis of faith. To accept that you of a different religion, me as a Reform rabbi, it's not just that they don't like us, but we're talking about the psychology of crisis in this world. And we talk about mental health, but we don't think about it in terms certainly of what makes people become very narrow in their frames of reference when it comes to religion. But please remember that when you're meeting people, whatever the religion or tradition, and they're very different, there are people are afraid. You're afraid that somehow they have a truth that might compromise yours or yours theirs. And it goes back to that I don't think we're faithful enough in who we are as humans to be, I'm good and so can you be. And I can live next to you. And there's ways that we can accommodate each other in our communities without having to take over or kick out. And those are the tough conversations that no one wants to have, because we want the immediate, I don't want or I must have. And that takes us to the next slide, which is the last one. So we've met the enemy and he is us. My favorite cartoon from Pogo, overlooking the river filled with all of the trash on the first Earth Day. But when we point fingers at the ultra-Orthodox who are moving into the community and who are taking over, and we wonder, why do they need to take over? And part of it, they have to look at why do they need to, why can't they learn to coexist, which means broadening horizons, but why is it that we can't do it either? How do we combat fear? One of the great treasures of this program, and I was there at the very beginning, meeting in the basement, or the bottom floor of the library, and some great conversations we participated in, is that you foster the tough conversations that no one wants to have. But if we don't have, we've talked about reparations, we've talked about all sorts of issues around the LGBTQ, about religious discrimination, women's rights. And so the Red Bank Library is to be cherished for this program and the work it does by making sure that people have these conversations. And I would argue that I think the next series of conversations to host are people who, in both sides of the argument, are willing to talk about why they are so afraid or insistent, which I would argue is the same thing, about needing to have their way or keep someone else from having their way. And the one going back to, is all fundamentalism wrong? No, if we're fundamentally pluralistic, if to the depths of our soul, we really want to believe that everything devolves back to human, then we'll really find a way to coexist. And it may be that there are places where your congregation society is there and mine is here. And after all, don't we do that in church and synagogue and mosque all the time? Right? There are ways that we can respectfully coexist and support each other, which is the goal that every one of our religions teach. And even outside of the religious world, you know, the ethical tradition in America, which is the center in New York, which is the home for atheists or God optional. The fact is, it still roots in the ethics of the humanity. So how do we help shape the future? We help shape the future by looking past our own insecurities and figuring out there's a bigger picture than what I need or what I want. To truly, the answer is it's about the we. And that doesn't mean we're going to have working partners as soon as we start out. It does mean that if we are dedicated, Margaret Mead said, it takes a few committed people to change the world, and it's the only way it's ever changed. So I promise you, there are partners in all segments of the community that are willing to have these conversations. One of my dearest friends, Michael Melchior, Rabbi Melchior, who's the chief rabbi of Norway, former member of the Knesset, ultra Orthodox rabbi in Israel, and by the way, the only person that Hamas will speak with in the Israeli government. Michael's incredible about bridging gaps. And what he taught me is that I know who I am, but I also need to know who you are. So that's where I'll close tonight. But for questions or comments, or throw whatever you need to at me, I'm good. Any thoughts, concerns, arguments?
Well, I will say thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, so insightful and informative. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Actually, yes, I do have a question. Rabbi Kline, I think, first of all, thank you for a really wonderful, sensitive presentation. It was really, I think, just what we all need. But I guess one of the things that occurs to me is how we bridge these gaps when one group wants to impose their beliefs on another. We see this in many areas, in many aspects of society. And if that group also, and you did make a wonderful point about people not feeling welcome, but what if some groups are also refusing to interact at all with the community around them?
That's not unique to this situation.
Exactly.
That's racism in America.
Definitely.
And there are people who are willing and desirous of creating grassroots relationships. So I don't have the magic wand to say that you're going to move the entire community one way or the other, or I should say either side of the argument in the communities either way. But I do know that, to my knowledge, people aren't reaching out to the Lakewood community and saying, so really, how can we engage? There is abject dismissal because of the forcefulness that people feel. David Applefield, I don't know if any of you remember David. He lived in Red Bank for a short period and was running for Congress and had such an impact on so many of us in a very short period of time. David went to all of the places of fundamentalism and said he was running as a liberal Democrat. And immediately they would dismiss him. And then he would say, okay, but let's talk about our children. Do you love your children? I love my children. And conversations change dramatically. But how many people are willing to put themselves out to have that conversation? Or especially breaking the ice with the mosque even was challenging, because the imam at the Red Hill Mosque doesn't speak English. And so creating that relationship with the synagogue was really challenging. But because of persistence, they invited 30 of us to an iftar dinner, which then became an annual invite the whole congregation, the whole community to iftar and share. So you never know what inroads you can make if you don't make the really concerted effort. And you can't say, oh, I tried once. We have to be willing to know that we're going to be rebuffed, because they're afraid too of what it might mean to their world if they interact with somebody different.
Thank you. There's a comment from Joseph, who said it's a beautiful message, lots of wisdom, challenge indeed, but needs to be addressed. As suggested, it takes a few, maybe only one, respected voices to start the change.
I appreciate that, but Joe, that's been the relationship you and I have shared since we met 9 years ago. Susie Wyman had her hand up at some point.
Yes, Susan.
Yes. Rabbi, it's so nice to see you here.
I love you, dear.
Again,
You know
amongst us. It's such a wonderful feeling. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for your background.
So we're talking, I worked with you and saw how you reached out to Muslim congregations, to the mosque and to the Baptists in Asbury Park. But the very weight of the statistic that you told us about 100,000 people in central New Jersey, the scale of this I think changes landscape. And especially since, well, you mentioned that David Applebaum said, let's talk about our children. But this community does not allow their children to interact with children outside of orthodoxy.
Mhm.
So we can't use the same tools or the same strategies, it seems to me, with this tremendous population, as I saw you work so beautifully with these other populations. It just seems hopeless. So how do we get the resilience and the creativeness to move forward?
Susie, thank you for all of that and for your devotion. Absolutely. To put it in a different sense, right now, the state of California is realizing for the first time that white is barely even a plurality, never mind a majority, and having to face that reality that they never planned for. So while it was not something that happened overnight, it was something that for so many people happened overnight because they paid no attention to it along the way. This is what happened in South Africa with apartheid, when you end up finding that there's this huge population that you just absolutely had dismissed until you couldn't anymore. And what we are, I hope and pray, learning is that even while current standards of behavior don't open many doors, that doesn't mean they don't open any doors. And peace building was never easy. It is one of the most challenging tasks. And so many people, especially in a world where we are in a cancel culture of canceling relationships over anything over which we disagree, it is so hard to overcome that, to remember human. So, I was the interreligious chair for Central Jersey's Federation for 4 years. And every program I ran was subtitled Return to Human. And we were able to have some really tough conversations because we started with the human and the places that we really could interact, even if not agree, but understand the severity. So on gun violence, we don't start with guns or no guns. We start with how many of us want our children safe in the schools, which changes the dynamic of the conversation, even if it's your school versus my school. So I don't know that I have those answers. I know that if people really want to, im tirtzu ein zo agada, Herzl's words, if you really want it, it's not just a dream. But you have to be willing to be bruised a little bit along the way. Look at the people who were trained in the early civil rights movement to be prepared to be bloodied at the sit-ins just so that someone would pay attention. So I'm not giving you a hunky-dory, it's nice and it's rosy and I've got a magic wand. This is going to be one of the hardest conversations for your region to go through, especially because we have trained each other to not speak to each other. So I don't have that wand, but I know what the answer is going to take. I can't tell you how long it's going to take, but I do know, just from my time there are people in the Syrian Jewish community and in the Lakewood community in that area who do really cherish the idea of figuring it out, because some people read religious traditions to say, don't stand by while your neighbor bleeds, meaning the people who look like me, because I wouldn't live next to somebody else. And the rest of the people read, don't stand by while your neighbor bleeds, meaning if anybody's bleeding, we're in trouble. And Martin Niemöller said it best. When they came for the trade unionists, I didn't speak up. And came for the communists, they came for the Jews. When they came for me, there was no one left to speak. So many of us have learned that if for no other reason, that at some point it is our backyard, we need to be proactive. And that was just not the accolade to Linda in this program that I was throwing that out because I love y'all.
Uh-huh.
But this is a place, this forum has given rise to some great conversations that have lasted and grown long after the meeting ended. And I think that's what it takes. That's what it takes.
Thank you. Regina has her hand up.
Hi, Regina. You're muted, Regina.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's just beautiful. I have a small experience that made a big difference to me. I had a fender bender with a young Orthodox Jew. And I was very frightened because I was driving a car that I had not driven before. And it happened, I felt it was my fault, but it was small. So it was very interesting to watch the energy transaction when this happened, because there was an offense there. You could, I'm trying to explain it in energetic terms more than anything. And so, well, what are we going to do? And I says, well, I'm going to it. I was pointing, I had to go this way. He wanted me to go this way. So I went ahead and went this way because I was going to a doctor's appointment. And I got out, and I'm an old lady, and I had my walking stick. And I talked to him and I said, well, what can we do? And I said, I'm driving this car for the first time. I talked to him like he was my neighbor. We talked as though we loved each other, like we knew each other. That was a feeling I had, just talking to him as a young man who I had something happen with. Well, as we went through, and this was on a weekend, so he had the Sabbath, and he was going to call me back and tell me it's going to cost quite a bit of money, I think. And we started with quite a bit of money, and it got down to, I'm cutting to the chase here, it only cost $20, and I paid for it myself. But it was interesting to see how this transaction went on between us that could have been very scary and very offensive. And I could have, I just felt love for him. And I was so happy that he just dropped it. But we went through a scaling down of what could have happened had it been a fearful, that kind of thing. It was just wonderful. So this is a small thing that I think all of us can do. And those little things do accumulate, little things can make big happenings. Yeah.
I agree. Gail Riegler's on this. Gail's in Harrisburg, and I'm going to tell her a story on her that I've said, start up conversations with people that a priori you may not agree with. And she told me the story months ago about someone she met who was wearing a Trump t-shirt. And so she said, I don't understand. And she started with, please help and explain it to me. And rather than the ugly rebuff that we normally respond to politically, she had a wonderful conversation with this person who was able to explain to her, not that to her agreement, and Gail, correct me if I'm wrong, but not to your agreement, but you could understand this person felt passionate and willing and glad to have the conversation with you. Very different dynamic than we see play out on the political scene. So Regina, just like your experience, it's not what you expected, but that leap of faith gave you an opportunity to bridge a gap.
Yeah.
Patty, you have your hand up.
Hi, thanks. That reminds me of a story that some of you may have heard of. I think you've made a wonderful point, Rabbi Kline, about the importance of each of us putting into practice. I've heard several stories from you about just making the effort, visiting other people's places of worship, other people's homes, for example. And some of you have heard the story perhaps of a young man named Derek Black, who ended up renouncing the white supremacist movement that he grew up in. He actually, at one time, was the stepson of David Duke, the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And the change came with Derek. And if you look for his name on YouTube, you can see a couple of interviews with him. He was part of the white supremacist movement. He actually helped basically weaponize that website, the Stormfront, because of his beliefs. He goes off to college in Florida, and initially some of the students didn't want him there because of who he was. But some of the students befriended him, including one of the Jewish students who would invite people to his home every Friday for Shabbat dinner, and including Derek. And bit by bit, they became friends. True love and affection actually developed. And also Derek's girlfriend also bit by bit challenged his beliefs until he was won over. Anyway, there are, I'm sure, countless stories like that, but I think the point that you're making with us, Mark, is that there's really never a substitute for this one-on-one grassroots effort, despite the enormity of the problem.
Yep. The T.J. Leiden is a similar story. He was a skinhead, and his wife, even more virulent. He had met Simon Wiesenthal at one point and rejected everything the man said because, of course, of Wiesenthal's hunt for Nazis. But then one day he's watching his 2-year-old screaming the N-word at the TV screen. And it hit him that the only way that kid knew that word and who to scream it at was because he taught it to him. That the kid had no personal experiences through which he could have those feelings. Got a divorce, got custody of his kid, and now tours the country for the Wiesenthal Center, deprogramming skinheads. So you never know who you're going to touch.
True. All of these stories. Linda has her hand up, Linda Oppenheim, and we have about 5 or 6 minutes left.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Rabbi. It's great to see you. I not as much with religion, but more around race, but I think it would apply to this as well, is I've always get stuck on how to both call people in and call them out. I mean, sometimes behavior, sometimes statements, I think cannot be tolerated. We talk a lot about, you know, you're going to go to Thanksgiving dinner and the uncle blah, blah, blah is going to, and you've got to call out racism. And so that's, as I said, that's where I get stuck, is how do you both call people in and call them out?
You got to be honest. And the problem with not saying anything is that if you don't, then the person walks away believing that everybody agrees with what that person said. And everybody who didn't say anything says, am I the only one that felt awkward? And so that becomes a real problem. So you really have to say something, even if it might upset Thanksgiving dinner, if only for that reason. And it doesn't have to be real ugly. You can say, you know, Uncle John, you know, I'm not sure that that's appropriate. We can, you know, let's talk about something else, because I don't think I can agree with you on that. You don't have to call him a bigot at the table.
Right.
But you also have to remember that so much of what people say is said out of ignorance. Some of you met Leo Woodbury, an AME pastor, when I was in Florence, South Carolina. I was at an event, and he opened a very public event with a Christian prayer. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, it was a beautiful prayer, but I'm Jewish. And he looked at me and says, I didn't even think about that. Well, Leo and I became very close, and we opened the Justice First initiative that's now in 23 states dealing with environmental justice. It caused us to work with the late Julian Bond to lead the March on Columbia in 2000 to take down the Confederate flag in front of 25,000 people. Leo and I launched a program with Martin King III. I mean, and I don't mean to name drop. What I'm saying is that from that, the gesture of, instead of saying, that was an ugly prayer and you excluded me, created a relationship. I could never have imagined the blessings that have been shared in my world just because I handled it without the knee-jerk response. So, and he didn't, and again, it was not an intentional statement from him. And the number of people that say, don't Jew me down, and they have no understanding what they said, even though, yeah, they probably should, but that's just what they always, that's just what it was. One of the very first trials that I co-tried as a lawyer in Dumas, Arkansas, the football coach, white football coach, was screaming the N-word at his ball players, and they went on strike and stopped playing. And Larry Dunklin and I represented the ACLU in that lawsuit. And Larry, an African-American man, looked at the white football coach on the stand and said, "Coach, isn't it true you refer to your black players as the N-word?" And he said, well, yeah, but that's what you're called. You're in Dumas, Arkansas, which, excuse the expression, if you mispronounce it, it speaks a lot about the character, but be that as it may. But he grew up there all his life in a world where that was the norm. But he was beloved in the community. He would never say he was a racist. My grandfather called Sylvester, who was integral in taking care of him in his later years, his Schwarze, my Schwarze friend. Okay, and there's no part of my father that ever would have thought so. In fact, left a lot to Sylvester in his will as a member of the family. So we can't ignore the fact that there are people who say things and do things without the intention of malice. They're just not thinking, or as with white privilege, we just don't know any better because it's off our radar.
Yeah. And it's so kind of institutionalized and ingrained.
Yes.
So
yes.
Some people don't realize how offensive it is.
And then you say, well, you're preaching to the choir. And I realize that too often the choir thinks we get more than we really get. And we need to be preached at. The number of times I'll walk out of an engagement and I go, I just got schooled. When I was in Lexington, I was chair of the County Human Rights Commission. We investigated human rights abuses. And the pastor at First Baptist, which was a Hispanic church, said, if you want to hear God's word, you'll hear it only in my church. So I went to visit him and I said, maybe I misunderstood. He says, nope. And, I teach Old Testament, I teach New Testament, I teach Quran. And I said, show me. And he said, it's in between the lines. And now I'm saying, okay, so you're making this up as you go along. So the lawyer in me said, okay, I got you on this one. So do you know everything God knows? And he says, oh, absolutely not. And now I've got him and I got you. So in that realm of stuff that God knows, that you don't know that God knows, God could love me too. Oh no, God does not. And I'm thinking, okay, this is just a lunatic. And then he said the most prophetic words. He said, the fact that more people agree with you than agree with me doesn't make you right. And in that moment, I realized that he nor I were in the place where we were all in the place.
Exactly.
He had room to grow and I had room to grow because both of us were missing something. I walked in all high and mighty and I walked out hat in hand. And I'm blessed that I have those experiences and, and can deal with them most of the time better than others.
That is a blessing that you've been all in so many states and have seen so many different kinds of experiences and you know, been
I've
through
had
all of
incredible
that.
teachers. I mean,
Yes,
I don't take credit for any of this. I've had incredible teachers and I owe so much paid forward. And I'm blessed that I get the opportunity to do this work.
that is a blessing. Joseph has said, how to conduct civil discourse is a skill that can be learned.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. You don't have to go for the jugular because you disagree. So, but thank you, everybody, for having the faith and participating in this and asking me back to, I guess, in some ways, my hometown. You know, if there's anything that I can do, this is sacred work, and it's the sacred work wherever we are. And through Zoom and all these other things we get to do, we can continue to share.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate the blessing of letting me be with you tonight.
Wow. It's been all our pleasure, believe me.
It has been a pleasure and we feel blessed and thank you again so much.
Be well, everybody, and do good work.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Thank
you
you.
as
See you
well.
again soon.
Take
Thank you,
care.
everyone, for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Good
Thanks
night.
again. Bye now.